I think some people might be coming in as they arrive, and then I think we have someone in the lobby who can kind of, so thank you for coming, and my name is Hyeon Woo. I'm director of Institute for Asian Studies at Portland State University, and today we have a really special event to talk about his book, and then Dr. Jeff Kinkley, he has been really long supporter of the Asian studies, not only at the university, but also in a larger, greater area of the state of Oregon too. So without further ado, I'm going to just turn this over to President Jim Mokbol, and then he is on behalf of the Northwest China Council, and then he's going to introduce Dr. Jeff Kinkley.
Well, thank you, Hyeon, and thank you and the Institute for Asian Studies for providing this beautiful space today in the warm sun of Portland. And thank you all for coming. I know a number of you have been members of the Northwest China Council for a long time. A few of you may not know about us. We're a nonprofit, non-political organization formed 45 years ago to support a better understanding of China, U.S.-China relations, history, culture, business, and many things that have changed dramatically over the years. And thanks to your ongoing support, all of our members, we've continued through the last few years of some difficult times with the pandemic and virtual everything. And now we're back to in-person programming like we are today. And I really know Jeff well enough, I don't need this piece of paper, but I was babysitting my grandson this morning, so I think I forgot how to deal with adults. But, he's a professor emeritus of Chinese history at St. John's University in New York for about 36 years, I believe, a pretty long time, which in Portland time means that you started teaching before Mount St. Helens blew up. and of course, he moved to Portland after he retired and became a courtesy professor here at Portland State. And at that time, he joined our board of directors of the Northwest China Council. And people like me might have known Jeff because he's a translator and well known for his works of the translation of Shen Kongwen, including Imperfect Paradise, 24 Stories, I think that was 1995, and then another book called Border Town, or Bianchang, which was adapted to film, and it is our movie pick for this month. So if you want to watch that movie, Border Town, online, which is on YouTube, and then join Movie Chat with Shereen Ferry, our Movie Chat hostess over there. The Movie Chat for Border Town will be, on March 31st. Just not responsible for the subtitles. Translated the book.
It's not X-rated.
It's a great film. I really enjoy it. It's very calming and soothing to watch this particular film. So you're here to hear about his other things as author of Chinese Justice, the Fiction, Law, and Literature of Modern China, and some other books like that. And we'll move right on to get him online ASAP as we want to hear about his latest work, Chinese Mysteries, Crime Novels from China's Others, which was just published last year by the University of Hawaii Press. So please welcome Jeff Kinkley, our Northwest China Council board member, author, and translator to the podium. What
Thank you very much, Jim, for those splendiferous introductions. It's always an honor and a pleasure to speak before a PSU audience and Northwest China. Lots of old friends are here. Plus, I get to plug my new book. However, let's see if it works backwards. Does it still do? Yes, it does. Okay. These books enjoy mass readership, although their full range may not be fully apparent to even this audience, unless you join John Wong's Northwest China Council book discussion group, which goes way back to before I was at Portland, and they discussed the original Cho Xiaolong book, Nicole Mona's book, and so forth. Also, I see Lee Bartman is in the audience. There you are, thank you. Partly so as not to disincentivize you from reading the book, I thought I'd branch out and not give a traditional book talk so much as provide some broader comparative and historical perspectives as appetizers, and maybe also to lure you into getting into these collateral subjects that you may know better than I do during the Q&A. I've talked on other genres at PSU before. In 2016, in the full flush of our excitement at the Kinkley translation of The Three-Body Problem by Liu Cixin, we had that. I had much less authority to speak about that then, and there's been a lot of water under the bridge since. Major monograph by Mingwei Sung, S-O-N-G, is called Fear of Seeing, and that can be a guide to many of the translations in English for those who don't read the Chinese. Han Sun, Liu Cixin, Chen Qiufan. Michael Berry is another great translator. Sharon Carstens actually invited me in 2013 to talk about historical novels, but those were the highfalutin avant-garde novels of Moyen and people like that, rather than the popular historical fiction. I guess we think of Exodus, Northwest Passage, Ivanhoe. The interesting thing today, I think, would be to analyze the historical and quasi-historical novels that you find online, some of which go on and on and on. So, East Asian popular culture and its global ramifications is a huge topic. Anime, manga, K-pop, Korean soap operas. You had a Korean-American author here a month ago. Coincidentally, just 2 days ago, the Norman, Oklahoma Journal Chinese Literature and Thought Today came out with a new issue with a spatial theme of Chinese pop genres, with an emphasis on the web novels. This was kind of interesting. It's curated by Yang Renren, don't know exactly how to pronounce his name. It reminded me of the hyper-specialization of the web novels, and many of the authors themselves speak to particular niche readerships. So scholarship necessarily goes in that vein. Yang also spoke of two waves of genre innovation during the pre-communist Republican years, and the second in the internet age. He didn't mention crime fiction, but it might be partly justified because it has low social status in the People's Republic of China. But it was a good issue, very interesting. This encouraged me all the more to try to fill in for some of the years in between. Unfortunately, I do not speak Chinese or English as far as that goes, so it can't be all up to me. So, in childhood, I binged on, as we would say today, the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew. But my next real immersion in mystery fiction, believe it or not, was in Chinese. I was already a young professor, excited by the new post-Mao literature. I was looking for a focus topic, and I went into a famous New York Chinatown bookshop, which I think still exists. It's called Oriental Cultural Enterprises on Elizabeth Street. Maybe Stephen, remember?
Yeah.
It still exists today, I think. I came upon these anthologies, so I thought I would pay homage to them here. Crime fiction had been banned in the Chinese mainland for 30 years. Sherlock Holmes in Chinese translation was banned. There was a short period at the end of the 1950s when it was published for copies as a Daegu Kanwu, as they call it, as a classified fiction. But here we had collections of crime stories with very contemporary Chinese plots and recognizably Chinese locations. I had spent a few years in China, first time ever in the mainland, in 1980. It was as if these works had materialized out of thin air. As I was preparing this slide, it occurred to me, these are in simplified characters. Here's my joke about that. People in Hong Kong those days, sometimes they pretended that they could not read simplified characters, right? Of course they could. It was, as we would say today, an exhibition of attitude. They didn't even care about what was going on in the mainland in those days. Now, Also, I would say Hong Kong and Taiwan did not have much local production of their own crime fiction. Martial arts, fiction and film, that was a different thing. So, something you can see has already divided these works into two subcategories, crime fiction and detective fiction. As you can see from the covers, they both have to be solved by the Chinese police, the Gulanju. But here in the crime or actually legal system subgenre, you have a story by the mainstream author Wang Yaping about a lawyer. Lawyering and the Ministry of Justice had been abolished from 1959 to 1979. So this was rather daring. Of course, it looks like something like a show trial. But anyway, a lawyer is the hero of the story. Now for the whodunits. You see a little map of a Chinese city with its broad boulevards. If you have a stopwatch, it's possible to try to calculate opportunity to commit a murder. In the middle, we have a Chinese cop thinking about all these visages that he has seen. Could they be the same person in disguise? And in honor of the year of the snake, I selected this one. If somebody has killed over from poisoning, this is before the days of Putin, I guess, you might want to consult your snake specialist. So these PRC mysteries could not have emerged from thin air. They had to have a backstory. And I was an intellectual historian, so I investigated. One query that arose in the 1930s and 40s was, can detective fiction thrive in an authoritarian state? That's kind of off topic for my books, for my stories not written in China. But you might be interested in the Q&A. So I went on further trips to the PRC, mostly after the June 4th massacre. I had my government scholarship and I wasn't going to give it up. I interviewed relevant authors and publishers. The police were pretty firmly in charge of the genre even before the June 4th massacre. They were very talkative because I was one of the few foreigners in China at the time. So finally I wrote up my findings. That's the book on the left. I intended a sequel on full-length stories. The one on the left is mostly about what I consider the high tide of reconsideration of the legal system in the 1980s, with a few chapters on what I consider the golden age of the Chinese detective story in the 1930s and 40s. The one on the right could be called a collateral genre. I was kind of diverted by this new genre about corruption. It too is about the law, so there were some overlaps. There are a few murders in the anti-corruption fiction. It came under pressure, as did the short stories about even whodunits. Corruption fiction was basically closed down in 2002, just before Party Congress. Generic police procedural mysteries were and are still being written in China, but they seemed and seem to me so generic that despite their complex and rather ingenious plots, I found them oddly limited. Dismembered corpses, bizarre sociopaths, detailed forensic analyses. Some people like that. My wife and I binged a little bit on Silent Witness, the BBC production. After a few seasons, though, you can't take it anymore. And the BBC had some institutional and human interest angles that some of the Chinese stories don't. Some 21st century Chinese crime authors have introduced avant-garde tendencies. Ai is the main example there. He was a former policeman, and there have been some picaresque novels that we don't ordinarily think of as crime fiction by, for instance, Liu Junmin. Howard Goldblatt and Sylvia Lynn have translated some of those. They took the title of one of the more interesting ones. They retitled it as The Cook, the Crook, and the Real Estate Tycoon. I don't remember if there are any murders in there or not. In the year 2000, though, I was diverted yet again, diverted in both both senses of the word, because authors in the West were writing mysteries with PRC crime scenes for Western readers. These were original novels written in English or French, not translations from the Chinese. In time, cinephile authors from all over the world were writing them, and they were being read worldwide, only not in China. There were a few attempts. Some Zhou Xiaolong works were back translated, although they really were written in English to begin with, into Chinese, but it didn't work out very well for various reasons. Partly the Chinese just weren't interested. So I became curious all over again. Lucky me, I had briefly met Zhou Xiaolong, who was destined to become the king genre of the offshore China mystery. In his previous life, as a poet, scholar, interpreter, like his detective hero, Inspector Chen Hao, at a 1986 conference in Shanghai, just met him briefly. In 2000, Zhou had published his first Inspector Chen novel in the U.S. He came to the U.S. in 1988, and after making some comments about democracy, he wisely decided not to go back to China for a few more years. And here he is with his signature beverage, or at least the signature beverage of Inspector Chen. As cocaine is to Sherlock Holmes, coffee is to Inspector Chen. He complains about getting headaches from caffeine addiction and so forth. This is kind of touching and commonplace. Some wealthy friends of Zhou Xiaolong's in New York, I think they were in the real estate industry, had invited him, probably had to do with the fact that it's May 4th, and he in turn invited me. Fortunately, the friends paid for the luncheon, and afterwards we adjourned to the bar, and I had an interview with him, and some of that is excerpted in my monograph. I think it's the best part of the monograph, actually. The words of Zhou Xiaolong himself. That coffee cup, you know the date. This is the 107th floor of the North Tower. So you know what happened 4 months and 1 week later. The coffee cup survived because the owner of the restaurant had taken a few place settings home for a private dinner party. And that survived, and 250 people on that day. So we could call these the main topic of my monograph. China mysteries not made in China, offshore China mysteries, or you could call it offshored, but that would probably imply more deliberateness in a two-step process that would be appropriate for all of them. Mysteries by China's others. That gel during the publication process. Later it occurred to me maybe some of the authors wouldn't want to be known as China's others, but that was my choice. My operational definition then is full-length mystery novels with plots that unfold entirely or almost entirely in the China of our day, very much of our day. Really, it's the last 3 decades in most cases, but they were not written or published there. You wouldn't call these Chinese mysteries. That would imply that they were written in Chinese to begin with. Most of them were not, even for the bilingual folks. And on the other hand, it might indicate that most of them were written by Chinese people. Of course, who are Chinese people? We could have an hour and a half to talk about that, right? That's another can of worms. In the larger scheme of things, the topic may seem small. It's within a larger category. The larger category, most of that, of course, is written in Chinese in China, published in the People's Republic of China. And that, of course, is part of a still bigger category. Defining even that is contested, as we say these days. Is it crime fiction or detective fiction, world or global? Even that is a matter of controversy. Is it literature? It was Xiaozhi Qing, C.T. Shaw's favorite great Edmund Wilson, who said detective stories, this was 1944, were a minor vice somewhere between smoking and crossword puzzles. I do take genres to be social constructs. They change with time and taste. Franco Moretti, the Italian literary historian, for instance, theorized that genres last about a generation. He was thinking of English genres, I think, in the 19th century. And the changeover is often influenced by political changes, which would fit maybe both China and the US. Of course, it's publishers who mediate the political changes over here. In my opinion, the offshore China histories are fun to read, and they have things to say about the post-Mao Chinese reform era. About the legal system, not so much. And they tell us something about the attractions of popular literature. Some of the attractions, not just for crime stories, but science fiction, historical fiction, and so forth, is reading for information. Crime fiction is relatively trustworthy. Unless they literally make stuff up, it's usually pretty reliable. I checked on the web, even shuttered restaurants. Their menus are available online. I checked it out. I mean, lots of notes. So these works also complicate the idea of world literature. Now here is the standard David Damrush idea of world literature. Not everything that was ever written, but the works that have had influence in other places, other cultures. The offshore China series reverses. It begins with a centrifugal impulse. People are attracted to China, and then they go out, they write their stories, and the centrifugal process begins. I thought later, well, it's not really spinning off the source, but most of the authors, including the ones born in China, like the ones who escaped the Soviet Union and went back a few years after the fall of the Soviet Union, they were allowed to go into China later, but then they came outside again and wrote their stories, which were in turn translated into various other languages. Cho Xiaolong says his had been translated into about 20 languages. Some of his favorite readers read him in French and Italian. Now, actually, this applies not simply to China mysteries, also South Asia mysteries. There are the people who write mysteries in the vernacular languages, as they call them. Like you probably know the famous movie maker Satyajit Ray. Pardon my Bengali. They've been translated into English. There are Indians and Pakistanis who write mysteries in English to begin with. It's a national language. There are daisies, and there are people like H.R.F. Keating, who became a prize winner for his Inspector Gautier novels. And after winning enough prizes, he said, I'd better go to Bombay and find out what the place is really like. We don't have any authors like that. We have some people who have had very little contact with China, but they have collaborated with other people. So, now this shows nesting of subsets. It's not mathematical, but what would it represent? Number of titles? One thing I have control over is the orange circle. That's 100 plus titles and growing. I read all of them except for a couple of new ones. Crime fiction in the larger category, including that presumed China, who knows how many titles. And of course, Agatha Christie dominates the world of crime fiction still today, I think. Circulation, that is proprietary information, even in, or particularly in our capitalist society. What might be most interesting would be how influential is each category of writing. Crime fiction in the middle circle, written in Chinese, is not without influence. It's not much read, I would say, in Hong Kong or cinephone communities in Australia or the United States in the original. They don't like to read it in simplified characters, for one thing. The translations are pretty good, and there are some of them have been done by Penguin. They haven't really taken off, even though I would say it's not the fault of the translators. What's big is Japan. Japanese mysteries written in Japan, Japanese locations. They're very big in the world market, including China. They outsell at least a few years ago, I don't know what the latest, they outsell the native works by Chinese authors. Several times over. Korean mystery fiction is translated into English in substantial numbers these days. I don't know whether that's available in China or not. So this raises another big topic in crime fiction studies today, the importance of crime scenes that are foreign to the intended readership, outside the touchy subject of exoticism, which in the case of Asian mysteries is often associated with dragon ladies, Fu Manchu, and other racist tropes. Some scholars have said that the focus of crime fiction in recent decades is more on the setting than on crime itself. That's probably farther than I would go myself, but ever since the importance of translating crime fiction, Nordic Mar and so forth, Slavoj Žižek, pardon my Slovenian, had these interesting theories about parallax, how people from different origins and different viewpoints view common items differently. Perhaps one of his earliest essays was taking global detective fiction, as he put it, as his example. It was a difficult thing, though, because many of our authors are pretty multicultural and multinational in their own position. A couple of the major writers of Italy mysteries, for instance, there was the Brit Magdalene Nab, and I think she pronounces her name Donna Leon, an American. They probably outsell many of the fine translations by Italian authors. What kind of intrigued me, it's not just Nordic noir, but Icelandic noir. See, my wife reads a lot of these things in English translation, but there's also a colony of Brits who write them in their own language to begin with, and have conferences on them. So I guess the Cod Wars are over for now. So in novels of crime, mystery, and detection, okay, we have murders, of course. Here we get into a parting of the road, for one thing. Usually we think spy novels is different from crime novels. They're not. Spy novels in China used to be for the uniform motive of sabotaging socialism. So whenever you get espionage or sabotage or that sort of thing, you think of spy. There is an alternative view by Stanford professor Haiyan Lee. Her book is entitled A Certain Justice. Crime fiction maidens may recognize that as the title of P.D. James' mystery. She considers the anti-spy fiction, Fantasy of the 1950s in China to be continuous with crime stories. I think most of us disagree. There is, of course, room for associated collateral crimes, including espionage, corruption, and so forth. Clues, suspects, the more the better. We're sounding like Colonel Mustard in the library and lead pipe, right? Detectives, here is another fork in the road. In China, crime has to be investigated by a professional, by a policeman. Most of them are Chinese Communist Party persons. One thing you could do is to have a foreigner come in, and they may be a professional associate, a forensics scientist or something of the Chinese cops. Or there's a Japanese solution. The official cop has a very intelligent crony who helps him solve. The favorite Japanese author in People's Republic of China, I think, was National Keigo. Not all of his works are crime fiction, but a lot of them. So places we talked about local color being an attraction. Information, that includes places, but a lot of other things too, often quite complex. I found it interesting anyway. A resolution of the mystery. If you think of getting mystery prepared to have something that's avant-garde. It helps to have a recurring hero in a whole series of novels, from Mike Hammer to Perry Mason, and a lot in between. 90% of our offshore Chinese readers say right on the cover, at least when they were reprinted, this is a detective so-and-so mystery or a Red Princess mystery. Of course, here's the paradox. You read a genre novel because you know what you're getting. You'll be disappointed if you don't get it, but you want to be surprised, right? Readability, that's another thing that varies. I remember in the collateral genre, the spy fiction, trying to get through John le Carré. I found that relatively unreadable. These are optional attractions that we find rarely in the offshore China novels. Sometimes you have crossovers of social commentary, satire, even humor. Crime fiction does have a history. The great judge tradition you probably have heard of, Judge Gao and so forth, usually called Guan court case story tradition. Whether or not the ones in the Sung Dynasty actually had to do with court cases, that's somewhat contested because there aren't excellent samples. But there are yuan dramas about legal difficulties in judging who's right and who's wrong. Case books. The detective story craze, I think, at the end of the chain in the early Republic was a crossover from interest in the Western genre. During this period, we have the vernacular literary revolution, sometimes called it associated with the May 4th movement and the Chinese New Cultural Movement. The replacement of the literary Chinese with modern vernacular. Zhang Xiaoqing, who became the master, was on both sides of it. He wrote stories in classical Chinese and participated in the translation of the complete Sherlock Holmes in the literary Chinese before the stories were complete, actually. Remember, he was killed off supposedly at the Reichenbach Falls, but then he became the master in what I think is almost like modern avant-garde, very scientific stories of the 1930s, some of which are translated by Timothy C. Wong in his book Sherlock in Shanghai. But he also superintended the retranslation of the more complete Sherlock Holmes into modern Mandarin. We get the ban on crime fiction, we've spoken before. Revival, which was noted by Chen Ying. Woodpecker, Zhuang Miao, was published by the Ministry of Public Security. Woodpecker picks out the evildoers, and it was in competition with magazines published by the Ministry of Justice, which had their crime-solving cases. But the police went out. All sorts of things have come on since then. Here's a slide I prepared for another talk. Many of you, I see a lot of specialists here, probably aware of David Wong, Harvard professor's Fantasy and Splendor. These were late Qing tendencies in literature that he saw as predecessors of his favorite stories of the 1990s from Taiwan and mainland. I saw these and said, oh, this is genre fiction. So you can go through all sorts of interesting things. What struck me as interesting is the continuities and discontinuities. Science fiction, or actually it's often called speculative fiction, of course is very strong, particularly in the PRC today, as it is in the world. It pretty much died out though, even in Taiwan. Mostly went into popular science writings. I think the main person in Taiwan was Zhang Xiluo, who mostly wrote in Chicago. However, in the People's Republic of China in the 50s, you had science popularization fiction, which had a certain fictional quality that was interesting. Presumably, it's quite different from what we see today. I don't know if there's any direct connection. For the chivalric and court cases, that of course feeds directly, mostly via Hong Kong. Chris Hamilton, University of Washington, has written books on it, to the martial arts novels of today, the detective stories, which flourished in what I think of as the golden age of the Chinese detective story in the 30s and 40s, I think is a fusion from that and the translations by Lin Shu and a lot of other authors. There is a monograph on that by one of David Wong's students, Vivian Yan Wei, called Detecting Chinese Modernity. You can see the continuity of interest in modernity. As to romances, today we have all sorts of genres, such as those that are in this new issue of the journal from Norman, Oklahoma, Dong Mei. I don't know if anybody's familiar with those online. This is a strange genre that originated in Japan. Boys Love, it's called. I think the Japanese is Boys Love. And it's male homoerotic narratives created and read by females. There are all sorts of psychological theories about that. I've noted in these online quasi-historical novels with beautiful temples and gardens and beautiful male faces. Really, I almost fell in love with them myself. I'm obsessed myself. I saw some kind of crossover there. All sorts of interesting things going on. In case you weren't aware of the fractionalization of popular genres, here's something that came from 5 or 6 years ago. In case you're still not convinced, here's another. I think this again 5 or 6 years ago. And in China, you have, again, it's from the past. Chinese fantasy with Harry Potter kind of characters, those with Taoists, those are the ones you find in the quasi-historical novels with beautiful temples and beautiful faces, and all sorts of interesting things. So, it's got me thinking about mystery fiction naming. Originally it was called Zhangtan Xiaohuo, but was replaced by Tweety Xiaohuo, which I think is from the Japanese, Suri Chuo. I don't know, what do they call them in Korean? They have, maybe something big there. Okay, you know, sometimes we have Zhangtan Xiaohuo together. We have the legal system literature of the 1980s, which was replaced by police literature. They went out. Gung An Manxue, not to be confused with Gung An Manxue, which is the original one. You notice from the Tang anthologies that he had crime fiction. This has been replaced now, I think, by crime committee fiction. Franz Leithoff, which I think is from Hanzai Shosei. What I'm getting at here is a distinction that is very big in Japan. The, pardon my Japanese, but Honkakuha or Shin Honkakuha, the orthodox original form school with stories that resemble Edgar Allan Poe, Conan Doyle, Edgar Allan Poe, Cheng Xiaoqing, and so forth, versus the social interest mysteries, the Shakaiha, which would be presumably Masamu Seisho, Yokoyama Hideo, which he wrote a global bestseller called 6-4, which is banned in China. I think even if you change the title, 6-4 would not be a good title. Not only China, the June 4. So let's get to the nitty-gritty. Cho Xiaolong is the king. He continues with his Inspector Chen mysteries, and he's also created a new series with Judge D as his detective hero. So this reminds us of Robert Van Kulik, or Van Kulik if you prefer. These are historical mysteries, therefore not a subject of my research. There's a lot of interest in him in Europe. It's practically an industry. Sabrina Yuan Hao has written the latest book. She's a professor in Australia for Brill. Di Renjie, Judge D, was a real figure of the 7th century, whom Van Gulik transferred into a vaguely Ming Dynasty environment in his original novels, which were all the ones to the right, the yellow one. The yellow one is actually an 1890 novel. Recent scholarship says it's not an 18th century novel, which Van Gulik translated and adapted. His fiction is shaped by stylistic elements from traditional Chinese fiction. I don't know that you'd necessarily call them Gun-an, Portuguese stories, but one of the most Chinese things about prototype is he did his own drawings, which look very much like Japanese woodblock illustrations of Ming novels, Ming-Qing novels, and so forth. He was already a Dutch diplomat and a sinologist. You see up there to the right. He translated Tanin Bishir, a 13th century casebook that provided MOs for certain crimes. If you want to murder your husband, maybe you could try dropping a nail in his head. Hope in pre-modern times nobody will notice. His other interest was in erotic art of China. You may have seen some of that, Beard Press and so forth. I highlighted his last novel, Poets and Murder, which was published posthumously in, 1968? Yeah. This is kind of interesting because, well, first I want to point out, Cho Xiaolong and the Dutchman have certain things in common. Both created a series detective. For Cho Xiaolong, I'm counting Inspector Chun, not the demons. They composed their series in English, which was not the first language of either of them. They were ancient Chinese culture agents and thus cultural interlocutors between East and West. They were both cultural diplomats in that sense. In fact, that if you read the Inspector Chun novels, one of the dilemmas of the detective is people are always taking him off of his cases so that he can be transferred for visiting foreign dignitaries. Cho and his hero Chun have as their callings, of course, poetry and Chinese cuisine. Maybe that's part of the attraction of John Wang. Van Gulik practiced Chinese calligraphy. He did those drawings, which professionals have written research articles on. And he played the guqin, kind of plucked instrument by Pacific. I highlighted Poets and Murder, which is about a real Han Dynasty female poet, a famous one, Yu Xuanji. She didn't actually live at the time of Di, but it's a useful anachronism. She was accused of murdering her female servant. So here are two of my favorite Cho Xiaolong mysteries. In one in the middle, Shanghai's Inspector Chun investigates the case of a 21st century Chinese socialite accused of murdering her female servant. It has lots of biting commentary on Chinese rule of law. As cover for his investigations, Inspector Chun collects historical materials so that he can write a Judge D mystery about the accused Han Dynasty woman poet that Van Gulik wrote about. That would be Shadow of the Empire. I recommend both novels. To sum up then, we have crime case thrillers. I've separated out historical novels, but there's such a big historical moat that it's very easy to do. I know of only one mystery novel that is even set exclusively in Mao era. Mao were published in China. They are published for mass Western readership. That's been tested. The Chinese are not interested. They are PRC's others. They're mostly boomers like me. Most of them are written in European languages. Unlike the PRC productions, they have global themes and implications. Most were written during or after, and the plot set in what I call the Sino-Western honeymoon. The first honeymoon would be Nixon in China, Deng Xiaoping wearing a Stetson, and all that sort of thing. This is after a certain recovery from the Tiananmen massacre. They display a generally upbeat fascination and approval with China's economic development. They might be nostalgic. How could you not be when you consider all creative destruction? They're not interested in ghosts, science fiction, or like many of the PRC and Japanese counterparts, or martial arts. very quickly go through the authors. Since I don't think I need to. Okay, this is the first one I know about. A couple of colleagues from the Miami Herald, Montalbano, I can spell it, Montalbano, provided all the China material. David Bonavia, we used to assign his books in the 80s about what was going on in the grassroots in China. Roger Ura and his wife both got arrested for espionage problems. I don't know about that. Christopher West created perhaps the first PRC detective in the series. He was a backpacker of the 1960s, a radical man in the 1960s who then went backpacking in China in the 1980s, and then, in the 1990s, and then wrote his mysteries. Pretty good. Van Lee Kun, she wrote sort of a signature Beset Citizen, not a Chinese cop, of course. It's an American journalist and bureau chief. Her original book had trouble getting published, but it circulated through the writing workshops in New York, and she did try to send it to Sandra Dykstra in San Francisco. Sandra Dykstra, however, was the agent for Lisa C., who, under her supervision, transitioned from a very famous family history to mystery novels, and then later on wrote historical novels, many featuring Chinese women, kind of in the vein of family mysteries like the Japanese-Chinese American author Gail Tsukiyama, Women in the Silk, maybe some of you have read. These are very good. Her hero is a female Ministry of Public Security operative. Yoon has written very recherche novels with all sorts of inside commentary about French leaders and pro-China cinephiles. Zhang Xinxin, I have put up here, her recent novel about an unemployable American sinologist who is hired by Hollywood to ferret out the film pirates. That's interesting. It hasn't been published yet. I hope Susan Wolf gets published for it. I put her up here because she did an early detective novel about the robbery of the Peking Express, which was the subject of, what's his name? Zimmerman's novel. Nicole Moniz, here's a local author. I don't know if she's still important, but these are not exactly a series, but there's a theme. It's very interesting of vulnerable single women in various professions trying to make their way in China and coming to all sorts of threats to their persons. Elliot Pass had a whole series of an anti-corruption Beijing investigator who got too close to the truth. He was exiled to Laodai in Tibet, the Gulag, and many amazing adventures. As I say, we don't do these things because they're so realistic. We love it because we love these novels because they make totally implausible things seem plausible. David Rutherford, Canadian drama teacher. Peter May, he is one of the folks who was a professional writer for TV and print media before he got interested in China, but then he went to China and befriended high McMucks in the public security ministry before he went on to write these novels. Choi Xiaolong comes in here. Liu Fan, who appears in Christmas at the
Royal Hotel.
Royal Hotel, yeah, a movie which we have seen. Thank you very much. She's very recorded, very smack. This is one of the books that actually was reprinted in China in simplified characters. That's sort of the exception that proves the rule. Michel Lambert, he has a judge hero with a sidekick who's a policeman. These are very good if you read French. Sorry, I don't think any have been translated into English. Those who know the Hong Kong literary scene perhaps are familiar with Nuri Vitachi, a humorist. He has his feng shui detective series. One of them is set in the beautiful China. There's all sorts of send-ups of different Singaporean and other belief systems and dialects. I don't think a white person can get away with called Orientals. Catherine Sampson was the Beijing correspondent during the Tiananmen massacre. She didn't write about it in her novels. She wrote articles. And she's created a series of journalists who collaborates with a very set Chinese private investigator. Don Felix Sinclair, this is another fellow who's sort of a loner misanthrope on the island of Lama outside of Hong Kong. And he ventures into the mainland to solve crimes on behalf of, as he begins to come out back in the world thanks to a Chinese travel agent in Hong Kong. Very good. I don't know. Oh, who is this? I recommend this, not only a China history, but also another thriller series, the Suffolk trilogy. Good. Recommend Diane Liang. She escaped from China after Tiananmen somehow, wrote a memoir and then detective fiction. Unfortunately, I haven't heard too much from her lately. Eddie Monkell is famous, but his comings over to China are not that numerous, and Kurt Wagner is not the hero of this novel. It's a woman district judge. The Chileans befriended the Chinese students at UCLA. It was Eric Stone and a series with Ray Sharp. One of them takes place in China. Here's one of my favorites, Lisa Brockman. In addition to her, they call China noir novels, some of which have actual protection. She wrote this Black Swan. It's a little bit too prescient about, of course, American politics. Paul Mason, this TV reporter Ruff, mixes it up with biker chicks in Inner Mongolia. His British broadcast system wants to do a show to kind of gloss over the Tiananmen problems. James Church, you may know of, he's created a series detective who's a North Korean of all things. It's kind of believable. He, in one novel, goes across the border to China to see his nephew. Ian Hamilton has written a whole series about Ava Lee. I like Princeton of Nanjing, in which he had a flowchart of corruption that had all these different boxes with the shell companies. Suitable for power. Chen Haoji, okay. You know, I mean, he's a good writer, right? Particularly well recommended in English translation. His wonderful translator is the Barrow, which has a backward chronology that's really quite interesting. 1967 is the time of the incident in Hong Kong because it's spillover from the Cultural Revolution in China. He's written other novels too. Kirk Kelson made a hero out of a two-time loser who goes to China, tries to make a life for himself. Jiminy Flynn as a hero, he's a detective. He doesn't even like Chinese food, but he is intelligent in his own way, and he has a local to team up with in Singapore. Of course, the Singaporeans turn out to be the bad guys. Adam Brooks has a spy series. The first one is, I think, capable of being judged as a crime story. Hunter Jefferson was the opposite. Went the opposite direction from Lisa C. He went from historical fiction to crime fiction. I don't know if he's written anymore. I haven't seen him. Same with Casey Walker, talented writer, product of a U.S. writing program. Cheryl West-Petty of Northern California. John Gapper wrote about production of laptops for a sort of Foxconn-like company, complete with jumpers. Which was a topic already introduced in novels by Lisa C. L.H. Draken likes CRISPR technology. Dan Manette is another local. You may have gone to his talk at the Portland, Maine College bookstore. On among you, she's probably a literary author, but I put her in here because her first book, which was the only one I'd seen at the time, begins on page 1 with a corpse face down in the bathtub. It's very strange. Nobody suspected the wife. Brian Klingborg has created since Inspector Chung 2.0. In fact, he even makes a joke. His character's girlfriend makes a joke about the Cho Show. These are also good. I thought I would mention this. The Japan is outside the purview of my research. He does publish in China. I don't know if he's influenced writing in the U.S., but there's some good translations in English. And one reason I shied away from him, the publication history of these novels, they keep changing and being rearranged and so forth. I don't know if he ran into troubles or what. He said he was inspired by Scott Turow because he got a law degree at the Northwestern Law School. So what's missing? I don't think I've come upon any Japanese authors. The Japanese do translate some China mysteries into Japanese, but I haven't seen them writing their own mysteries in China. And you know, the PRC does not have its own prizes for crime fiction, like the West and Japan and other countries that produce prizes for non-fiction. In 2009, the Japanese mystery author Shimada Soji toured the PRC in Taiwan, promoting the puzzle book, the Homeland Mystery. The Shanghai Daily wrote in December 2009, quote, "There are no Chinese counterparts to many famous Japanese mystery writers. Topics may be too dark, gruesome, and troubling for publishers' taste. As a result, Chinese readers devour Japanese mystery fiction of all kinds. Shimada says there are good writers in China and hopes to promote them." Quote. The impact, though, was greatest in Taiwan, which, with Shimada's support, established an international combined Chinese language mystery award. Lin Fuller in Taiwan had established a mystery magazine, even had a club, giving prizes, kept trying in the 21st century, but most of them fizzled out until the Shimadas came in. Most winners of the Shimadas have been from Taiwan and Hong Kong, a couple from the mainland, one from Malaysia, and the early winner in 2011 was Chen He. He is globally famous due to Jeremy Tiang's great translations. He's translated a lot of other authors too. In the PRC, he is known, and some publications there supposedly have called him the #1 author in the Chinese language of detective stories. I think it's hard to get a hold of his works, at least most of them. So, at this point, I could either go on for another 5 or 10 minutes and summarize the book a little bit, or we can go directly into the Q&A if you prefer that. What do you prefer? You have questions? Thank you.
I appreciate it very much. Your talk, very fascinating. My question is, where do you study Chinese in America and for how long? And where did you study Chinese in China for how long? American schools are not good in teaching foreign language. They don't even require foreign language as high school require graduation requirement. So I'm very interested in knowing, where did you learn your Chinese language to read and write?
It's a challenge, and we got to thank PSU for any interest at all in Chinese humanities, right? We thank PSU. No, I began at the University of Chicago learning it as a dead language. My approach was saved by a summer at the University of Michigan. I had a year at the Stanford Center in Taiwan, National Taiwan University in 73, 74. And one of my teachers at Harvard was a swimmer. He swam to Hong Kong. In Taiwan, they would call it the Tobenzuyo, right? So I was part of the second class of American officially sponsored people to go into China, the mainland, in 1980, again 1981, 1986, a few times after the Tiananmen. But whether my Chinese has been going forward or backward these days, it's hard to say. I'm not sure. One of the things that amazes me is how both English and Chinese change so rapidly, especially on the internet. Actually, I don't even understand all of the emojis. Nobody can equal the East Asians in their mastery of emojis, right? So it's mixed.
May I ask a second question? I want to know, with all your knowledge about what's going on in China, what are your thoughts about improving friendly relationship with China? Right now, it's very challenging. We need to improve ties with China to improve trust, trade, and world peace. So what are your thoughts about improving ties with China?
Well, at the very least, we need more contact, right? Unfortunately, we don't have Fulbright exchanges anymore. That's one good place to start. That's one of my few contributions to Portland State in the last few years. We used to send students to East Asia, and I helped out a little bit on the China destined people. We don't have that anymore. All sorts of abilities to feel each other out. However, if the U.S. is now the ally of Russia, then we're the ally of China. You never know what might come next. Right? Sir?
Well, so I also have two questions. If folks don't mind, I'll be real quick. The first one is I'm really interested in sort of how you're talking about the Chinese detective stories. What I found in the global environment is, like, I really like the Kurt Vonnegut stories that have, made it into not just the novels, but into like the British productions. So
Are you saying maybe Hollander? Kurt Hollander?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right,
If you have sort of a recommendation, that's sort of my small question. But actually, my bigger question is this: just as the earlier person asked, the U.S.-China relationship has changed so much. Like around the time of the Olympics, if you remember the Beijing Olympics, the countries were moving very close together, and you would see that in what people were writing, and books that would come out in English, at least I did. So I was wondering, in what you were following here, do you notice sort of a change in the tone or the change in sort of what's being talked about as the relationship between the two countries is changing?
Oh, yeah. On both sides, right? It's such a big question. The number of students in America studying Chinese or going to China has lessened. The number of Chinese students coming here, for instance. Obviously, technological exchange is another very fraught question. So many things. And what U.S. policy will be now and what impact it might have, it's anybody's guess, right? We don't even know whether there will be tariffs or not. Here today, gone tomorrow. Sorry, that's a really big question. I'm not the most qualified, actually.
I was just wondering if it shows up in the stories, is all I'm saying,
In the histories themselves, do you see, I think.
Oh, and the histories themselves?
Yeah,
No.
that's what
Oh,
I
it's
was
very positive, it's very upbeat. The view of China is extremely upbeat.
All the way through. It
All the way
doesn't
through.
change.
There is some criticism. Cho Xiaolong's later novels have criticism of it. It's amazing that Inspector Chun still can do his investigations, but most of these people, although they have criticisms of the tearing down of the old hutungs in Beijing and that sort of thing, and the loss of old values, nevertheless, they like it, and they see the persistence through it all of old Chinese values of not necessarily embracing strangers more than somebody who's related to you, but always being able to help out a person in distress, like Mencius, right? If you see a child about to fall down a wall, a Chinese person is quite likely to help. Again, there are exceptions, obviously. There is anti-foreignism too. But as to Kirkland, I really can't help you on that.
It's okay.
One unfolds in China and in Sweden and in the USA is an exception. Also, it unfolds in Mozambique. It's one of the ones that has, because Mozambique was the second home of Henning Mankell. Yeah, Bob.
I was just going to say, talks like yours today help us appreciate the exchange of culture and bring us closer together. I'm also happy to report, because it's getting a little depressing when you're watching the news, but Portland International School sent 10 capstone students from their school to Suja yesterday. And they're going to spend 2 weeks in Suja at the international school there. So we have like 10 schools in Portland who used to do international exchanges with Suja. I'm not quite sure the pandemic sort of slowed that down, but I imagine it's beginning to happen again. And so I think, the exchange of education, the exchange of culture, and hopefully if we can keep the trade going, but that's we can keep this process of friendship going.
Suzhou and Shanghai were the center of the golden age of the Chinese detective story in the 30s and 40s. I was able to interview Zheng Xiaoqing's son. In Suzhou, he lived there, he played clarinet, he was a Methodist, he took correspondence classes with the U.S. About how to write detective stories. One of his favorites was Philo Vance. Yeah, it's kind of too bad what's happening between the two nations.
We just have to keep getting going.
Yeah, Wendy.
Thank you for that. So I want your opinion about what would happen if you or I were to take a Chinese pen name and publish a novel. I think you know that we would end up in a huge minefield if we were to write detective fiction set in China with a Chinese pen name. And I noticed that there's very few people on universities on your list. It seems like it. I don't know a lot of these writers, but I do know Nicole Mons really got thrashed for her novel. And
Oh, it's reviewed in China?
yeah, no, here.
Oh, here.
Here. Yeah, and I was wondering what has been the reaction in universities among people who study China to these novels? Or is there a reaction?
These are pitched largely toward people who are not academic sinologists, I would say.
But they study everything, comic books, I mean, are you the first person to look at these?
There are a few articles about Zhou Xiaolong in particular. Very little else, actually. There are some critical articles in Chinese. I wrote one of them, criticized Zhou Xiaolong as something like beware of cultural brokers.
Cultural brokers.
So putting a kind of capital spin on it. There is very little, part of the thing is crime fiction is not well regarded in China itself, and it suffers sometimes in reputation internationally too, because it is kind of a niche interest. I don't think there's any scholarship in Chinese in China on any of these topics. There isn't much scholarship in China on the Chinese detective stories that I talked about earlier on. No prizes for them or anything. It's sensitive because it's talking about a crime, and the people who might object are the people who are in charge of the city in which you chose to have your crime. So that's why So many of the ones in Chinese have H city, standing for Shanghai, Hu, I guess it is, as on the license plates, even Chouxiaolungs. And yeah, there are unfortunate vaguenesses. That's an interesting question. I think history through literature is not a favored topic in literature departments today, as they still exist, right? Comparative literature is not.
I mean, this is really a brand of Western literature, right? I mean,
Yeah, it's definitely Western
a
literature.
genre of Western literature.
Yeah, this would be an alternative way to define it. In fact, I said detective novels, crime novels, not written or published in China. It could be, some would say, well, they are published for a Western audience. But writers also try to embody their own world views, and that includes their view of Sino-Western relations. And you see, there's a diverse group of authors here too. They are mostly trying to make money, of course. The main constraining thing, of course, is publishers. That's something I go into in my monograph. Somehow in 1997, the floodgates opened, and the public, particularly the American publishing world, was open to these detective stories set in China. Some would say that the multinational detective story really wasn't very strong until the 1990s. There had been Tony Hillerman writing about the Navajo tribal police, I guess as early as the 1970s. Evidently, Lieutenant, what's his name? Joe Leaphorn is based on a Caucasian sheriff that Hillerman met in the Panhandle of Texas, not a native whom he met in the Four Corners country. So when it comes to cultures, there's lots of mixing and matching.
For another subset would be maybe the American Chinatowns or North American Chinatowns with their murder mysteries. How would that correlate with the popularity of those? Did you ever kind of compare those two to see the difference between the Chinese mainland situated, dramas versus the ones that were American based, but in Chinatown, so to speak, New York or San Francisco?
There are a lot. Of course, it goes back to Charlie Chan, which makes it kind of a simple thing in the whole business of the movies. I think Charlie Chan went to China in one, I forget what this novel or movie. He's from Honolulu. And yeah, there are ones, particularly Taiwanese Americans, and Taiwan now has its own mystery fiction set in Taiwan.
Okay.
And there are a few Chinese who write American mysteries. Not very many. There's a guy, I forget, he called himself Tony H. Hui or something. He wrote about art thefts from American museums. And Yen Goling, I think, is one who writes in both English and Chinese, and some of them have to do with murders. Husbands. So yeah, there's books.
Read all those books that you were talking about at the top. That's amazing. That's really wow. You gotta be the expert.
Late night walks
Yeah.
to avoid fellow pedestrians. Lots of time to think about these things.
I'm surprised you're not scared to take late night walks.
I made notes because you have to. The plots are so complicated. And as a one-time geography major, I was interested in the places,
Right, sure.
checking them out.
Let's thank Jeff